The year is 52 BC. A young warrior rides through the frozen mountains of Gaul, rallying an army that will shake the foundations of Rome itself. His name is Vercingetorix, a name that means victor of 100 battles. He is the son of a murdered chieftain, heir to a legacy of defiance, and he has just done the impossible. He has united the warring tribes of Gaul under a single banner. For the first time in their history, the Gauls stand together as one nation, one army, one people. Their enemy, Julius Caesar, Rome's most brilliant general, a man who has already conquered half the known world. But Caesar has never faced an opponent like this. He has never fought a war where entire cities burn themselves to the ground rather than feed his legions. He has never been trapped between two massive armies with nowhere to run. And he has never stared across a battlefield at a king willing to sacrifice everything, his people, his freedom, his very life, for one chance at liberty. This is the story of the last king of the Gauls, the man who nearly broke Caesar, the warrior who turned guerrilla tactics into an art form and made Rome bleed for every mile of Gallic soil. This is the story of history's greatest underdog rebellion, a tale of impossible courage, devastating betrayal, and a siege so brutal that it would define warfare for 2,000 years. This is the story of Vercingetorix, the man who united a nation against Caesar. And this is how he came within a hair's breadth of changing the course of Western civilization forever. Before we dive into this epic tale of rebellion and sacrifice, help us bring more stories from the brutal truth of history to life. Hit that like button, smash subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Your support keeps this channel marching forward. Now, let's witness the rise of the last king of the Gauls. To understand Vercingetorix, you must first understand what Rome had done to Gaul. For 8 years, Julius Caesar had been carving a path of destruction through the Celtic lands. What began in 58 BC as a defensive intervention against the migrating Helvetii tribe had transformed into a systematic conquest of genocide and enslavement. Caesar's legions moved like a machine, relentless, disciplined, unstoppable. Wherever they marched, entire populations were either slaughtered or sold into slavery. At the city of Avaricum, Roman soldiers butchered nearly 40,000 men, women, and children in a single day of vengeance after a grueling siege. The rivers ran red. The screams echoed for miles. But Gaul was not a unified nation. It was a patchwork of tribes, the Arverni, the Aedui, the Sequani, the Helvetii, each with their own kings, their own territories, their own blood feuds stretching back generations. The Gauls were fierce warriors, legendary for their courage in battle, but they fought as individuals, as clans, never as one people. This was their fatal weakness. Caesar exploited it brilliantly. He played tribes against each other, offering protection to some while crushing others. He recruited Gallic auxiliaries to fight their own brothers. He made allies of chieftains who saw Rome as the lesser evil compared to their ancient rivals. By 53 BC, it seemed Gaul's fate was sealed. The conquest was nearly complete. Then came the winter of 53 BC, and with it, whispers of rebellion. The catalyst was a man named Vercingetorix, son of Celtillus of the Arverni tribe. His father had been a powerful chieftain who once dreamed of uniting all Gaul under Arvernian leadership, but he had been executed by rival nobles who feared his ambition and his vision of kingship. Vercingetorix inherited not just his father's name, but his father's dream and his father's enemies. He grew up in the shadow of that betrayal, watching as Caesar's legions methodically destroyed everything his people held sacred. He saw the burnings, he heard the stories of mass enslavement. He watched Gallic warriors die fighting for Rome against their own kinsmen, and something inside him snapped. In the dead of winter, while Caesar was in Italy attending to political matters, Vercingetorix made his move. He gathered the young warriors of the Arverni in secret, bypassing the tribal elders who had grown comfortable with Roman dominance. He spoke with the fire of a prophet, reminding them of their ancestors' glory, of the time when Gallic warriors had sacked Rome itself in 390 BC. He painted a vision of a free Gaul, united not by Roman chains but by Celtic blood and shared destiny. His charisma was magnetic. His words cut through generations of tribal rivalry. One by one, the young warriors pledged their swords to him, and then came the other tribes, first the reluctant, then the eager, then the desperate. The Bituriges, the Senons, the Parisii, the Carnutes, tribes that had spent centuries killing each other now gathered under a single banner. At the fortified hilltop settlement of Gergovia, the Arverni capital, Vercingetorix was formally proclaimed king and supreme commander of the united Gallic forces. It was an unprecedented moment in Celtic history. For the first time, Gaul had a single leader, a single purpose, a single enemy. Vercingetorix was only in his late 20s, but he commanded with the authority of a seasoned general. He understood something that no Gallic leader before him had grasped. They could not defeat Rome in open battle. The Roman legions were too disciplined, too well trained, too experienced. But they were not invincible. They needed food, they needed supplies, they needed roads and communications. Cut those lifelines, and even Caesar's legions would starve. So Vercingetorix implemented a strategy that Rome had never encountered in Gaul, a scorched earth policy combined with guerrilla warfare. He ordered his own people to burn their crops, destroy their villages, and evacuate to fortified positions. Nothing would be left for the Roman foragers. Every supply convoy would be ambushed. Every Roman patrol would be harassed. The Gauls would not give Caesar the decisive battle he wanted. Instead, they would bleed him slowly, mile by mile, until his legions collapsed from exhaustion and starvation. It was a brutal strategy, one that demanded immense sacrifice from the Gallic people. Families watched their homes burn. Farmers destroyed the grain that would have fed their children through winter. But they did it willingly, because Vercingetorix had given them something more powerful than comfort. He had given them hope. When Caesar received word of the rebellion, he was stunned. He had thought Gaul was pacified, its spirit broken. Instead, he was facing the greatest threat of his military career. And he was in Italy, separated from his legions by the Alps and hundreds of miles of hostile territory. What happened next would become the stuff of legend. Caesar marched, his army through the Alps in the dead of winter, cutting through snowdrifts 6 feet deep, moving with such speed that the Gallic scouts could barely believe their reports. The mere fact that he had arrived, that he had crossed mountains considered impassable in winter, sent shockwaves through the rebellion. But Vercingetorix did not falter. He had expected Caesar to come. In fact, he was counting on it. The stage was set for a conflict that would determine the future of Western Europe. On one side stood Julius Caesar, politician, general, conqueror, leading 10 battle-hardened Roman legions, approximately 50,000 professional soldiers, backed by auxiliary cavalry and siege engineers. On the other side stood Vercingetorix, the last king of the Gauls, commanding an army of perhaps 80,000 tribal warriors, united by desperation and a dream of freedom. What followed was a campaign of stunning brutality, tactical brilliance, and ultimately tragic nobility. The rebellion would rage across Gaul from the frozen forests of the north to the sun-baked plateaus of the south. Cities would burn, armies would starve, and at a small hilltop fortress called Alesia, the fate of an entire civilization would be decided in one of the most extraordinary sieges in military history. This is where the legend truly begins. The first blow of the rebellion was struck not by Vercingetorix, but by the Carnutes tribe in the dead of winter, 53 BC. In the town of Cenabum, along the banks of the Loire River, Roman merchants had established themselves as the economic overlords of the region. They controlled the grain supply, dictated prices, and lived in luxury while Gallic farmers starved. Caesar had installed an overseer named Gaius Fufius Caesar to ensure the flow of supplies to his legions. The Carnates had endured this occupation with gritted teeth, but when their chieftains Cotuatos and Conconetodumnos called for action, the people responded with rage. They stormed through the streets of Cenabum, dragging Roman merchants from their homes and butchering them in the streets. Caesar and the Roman garrison were overwhelmed, massacred, and their bodies thrown into the Loire. The river carried their corpses downstream like a message written in blood. Within hours, word of the massacre spread across Gaul at impossible speed. Caesar himself noted that news travelled 160 miles by midnight. The spark had been lit. Vercingetorix seized this moment with both hands. He gathered the young warriors of his Arverni tribe and delivered speeches that would echo through the ages. He reminded them that their grandfathers had once sacked Rome itself in 390 BC, that Gallic warriors had terrorized the Mediterranean world, that they were not slaves but free men descended from gods and heroes. His uncle Gobanitio, fearing Roman reprisal, tried to expel him from Gergovia, but Vercingetorix had already built too much momentum. He returned with an army at his back and seized control of his homeland. At a gathering of tribal leaders, he was proclaimed king, a title that had been forbidden among the Arverni since his father's execution. But these were desperate times, and desperate times demanded a king who could unite them. Tribe after tribe pledged their support. The Bituriges, the Senones, the Parisii, the Carnutes, ancient enemies, now stood shoulder to shoulder under Vercingetorix's banner. By early 52 BC, he commanded an army of approximately 80,000 warriors, the largest unified Gallic force ever assembled. Caesar's response was lightning fast and utterly ruthless. He marched his legions through the snow-choked Alps in the dead of winter, a feat considered impossible by every military standard of the age. His arrival in Gaul sent shockwaves through the rebellion. Some tribes wavered, wondering if they had made a fatal mistake. But Vercingetorix did not flinch. He implemented his scorched earth strategy with brutal efficiency. He ordered his own people to burn their villages, destroy their crops, and evacuate to fortified positions. Nothing would be left for Roman foragers. It was a strategy of total sacrifice. Families watched their homes go up in flames. Farmers destroyed grain stores that would have fed their children, but they obeyed because Vercingetorix had convinced them that freedom was worth any price. Caesar later wrote that fires were visible in all directions, the entire countryside ablaze. The Romans would have to fight for every scrap of food, every mile of ground, and Vercingetorix would bleed them slowly until they collapsed from exhaustion. Caesar struck first at the towns that had betrayed him. At Vellaunodunum, his legions stormed the walls and enslaved the survivors. At Cenabum, where the rebellion had begun, Caesar showed no mercy. His troops arrived at dawn, catching the population trying to flee across the narrow wooden bridge spanning the Loire. The Romans scaled the ramparts while panicked. Civilians crushed each other on the bridge. Women and children trampled underfoot. Once inside, the legions went berserk, They killed everyone they could find, looted everything of value, and burned the city to ash. The Carnutes' chieftains were captured and executed. Caesar left 2 legions under Gaius Trebonius to garrison the ruins as a warning. But the massacre at Cenabum had the opposite effect of what Caesar intended. It did not break the rebellion, it hardened it. Vercingetorix used the atrocity as propaganda, proof that Rome offered only slavery or death, that there could be no negotiation, no surrender, only victory or annihilation. The Bitterstweet tribe presented Caesar with his next target, their capital at Avaricum, a fortified hilltop city considered the most beautiful in all of Gaul. Vercingetorix had ordered it burned along with 20 other Bitterstweet towns in a single day, but the people of Avaricum begged for mercy, pleading that their city was too magnificent to destroy, too well fortified to fall. Against his better judgment, Vercingetorix relented. He positioned his army nearby to harass Caesar's siege, but he would not commit to a direct assault. Caesar, whose legions were starving and exhausted, saw Avaricum as a prize he desperately needed. The city held massive grain stores, enough to feed his army for months. He began siege operations in early spring 52 BC, despite incessant rain that turned the ground to mud. His engineers constructed 2-wheeled siege towers, each 80 feet high, along with ramps 330 feet long, and a massive siege terrace. The work took 27 days while Vercingetorix's cavalry harassed Roman foraging parties and supply lines. Inside Avaricum, 40,000 people, men, women, children, prayed for relief that never came. When the walls finally fell, Caesar's legions went insane with bloodlust and hunger. They had been starving for weeks, watching their comrades die of exposure and malnutrition, and now they wanted vengeance. The massacre lasted for hours. Roman soldiers killed everyone they encountered, old men begging for mercy, women clutching infants, children hiding in cellars. They raped, they burned, they butchered until the streets ran with blood and the screams faded to silence. Caesar himself admitted that his troops slew 40,000 people that day. Only 800 managed to escape, fleeing at the first alarm to join Vercingetorix. The city that had been called the most beautiful in Gaul was left a charnel house, its walls blackened by fire, its gates choked with corpses. Caesar's legions gorged themselves on the grain stores, but the psychological cost was immense. The Gallic coalition did not break. Instead, more tribes joined Vercingetorix, convinced that Rome was not merely an oppressor, but a force of pure evil that had to be stopped at any cost. Vercingetorix retreated to his home fortress at Gergovia, the hilltop capital of the Arverni, and there he prepared for Caesar's assault. The fortress sat atop a plateau with steep slopes on all sides, naturally defensible and stocked with supplies. Caesar arrived with his legions and began siege operations, but he quickly realized this would be nothing like Avaricum. Vercingetorix had learned from that disaster. He refused to allow Caesar to isolate him, keeping his army mobile and ready to strike. Meanwhile, Vercingetorix worked his diplomatic magic. He sent envoys to the Aedui, Caesar's most powerful Gallic allies, convincing them that Rome's promises were lies, that they too would eventually be enslaved and destroyed. The Aedui chieftains Convictolitavis and Litavicus secretly agreed to betray Caesar. The trap was set. Caesar, unaware of the coming betrayal, launched an assault on Gergovia's fortifications. His troops advanced up the slopes, scaling walls and seizing the southern camps. But confusion set in when the attack went further than Caesar had ordered. Legionaries hungry for victory and loot pushed deeper into the fortress than planned. Then disaster struck. Vercingetorix launched a massive counterattack from the higher ground, thousands of Gallic warriors pouring down the slopes onto the overextended Romans. At the same moment, Edwy reinforcements that Caesar had summoned to support the assault arrived on the battlefield, but they did not attack the Gauls, they attacked the Romans. The Edwy had switched sides mid-battle, and the Roman legionaries, surrounded and attacked from multiple directions, panicked. What had been an organised assault became a chaotic rout. Roman soldiers scrambled down the slopes in terror, trampling each other, abandoning wounded comrades. The Gallic warriors pursued them relentlessly, cutting down stragglers and hurling javelins into the mass of fleeing men. Caesar himself had to ride into the chaos to rally his troops and prevent total collapse. When the bodies were counted, Rome had lost at least 700 soldiers and 46 centurions, though the true numbers were likely far higher. Gergovia was Caesar's first major defeat in Gaul, and Vercingetorix had inflicted it. The news of Caesar's defeat spread like wildfire across Gaul. Tribes that had been sitting on the fence now rushed to join Vercingetorix's coalition. Even more devastating, the Aedui formally declared war on Rome, cutting off Caesar's supply lines and isolating his legions deep in hostile territory. For the first time in the Gallic Wars, Caesar faced the real possibility of total defeat. He was outnumbered, running low on supplies, and trapped in the heart of Gaul with enemies on all sides. Vercingetorix had achieved the impossible. He had united the Gauls, defeated Caesar in open battle, and turned Rome's most powerful allies into enemies. The momentum had shifted, victory seemed within reach, but Vercingetorix made one critical miscalculation. Emboldened by his success, he abandoned the guerrilla tactics that had brought him this far and prepared to face Caesar in a decisive confrontation. He believed the time had come to crush the Roman legions once and for all. That decision would doom everything he had fought for. The victory at Gergovia should have been the beginning of the end for Caesar. His legions were bloodied, demoralized, and running critically low on supplies. His most powerful Gallic allies had betrayed him. Vercingetorix controlled most of Gaul and commanded an army that now numbered over 100,000 warriors. The rebellion had spread like wildfire. Tribes from the Atlantic coast to the Rhine were sending warriors to join the coalition. For the first time since arriving in Gaul 8 years earlier, Caesar faced the very real prospect of annihilation. His political enemies in Rome were already circling, preparing to prosecute him for his illegal wars and massacres. If he lost in Gaul, he would lose everything: his army, his reputation, his fortune, and quite possibly his life. Caesar needed to retreat, to consolidate his forces and regroup. But retreat meant abandoning the territory he had spent years conquering, and it meant admitting defeat to a barbarian king. That was something Julius Caesar could not stomach. Caesar made a desperate gamble. He ordered a retreat northward toward the province, linking up with his lieutenant Labienus, who commanded 4 legions in the north. The 2 Roman forces combined gave Caesar approximately 60,000 soldiers, 10 full legions plus auxiliary cavalry. It was still fewer than the Gallic coalition, but it restored some numerical parity. More importantly, the junction of forces restored Roman morale. The legionaries saw that they were not isolated, that reinforcements existed, that Caesar had not abandoned them. But the supply situation remained catastrophic. The scorched earth policy had worked exactly as Vercingetorix intended. Everywhere Caesar's foragers went, they found burned villages, empty granaries, poisoned wells. The Roman supply lines stretched back hundreds of miles through hostile territory, where every convoy was ambushed, every messenger killed. Caesar's Germanic cavalry auxiliaries, recruited from tribes across the Rhine, proved invaluable during this period. They were the only horsemen who could match the Gallic cavalry in speed and ferocity, but even they could not conjure food from ashes. Vercingetorix, emboldened by his victory at Gergovia and the defection of the Aedui, made the decision that would ultimately doom the rebellion. He abandoned the guerrilla tactics that had brought him success and decided to face Caesar in a decisive cavalry engagement. He had reason for confidence. Gallic horsemen were legendary throughout the ancient world, far superior to Roman cavalry in skill, equipment, and tactical doctrine. Vercingetorix commanded approximately 15,000 cavalry, organized into tribal squadrons led by noble warriors who had trained for mounted warfare since childhood. These were not mere scouts or skirmishers. They were heavy shock cavalry, armoured warriors capable of shattering infantry formations. If Vercingetorix could destroy Caesar's cavalry, he could cut the Roman supply lines completely and force the legions to surrender or starve. This strategy was sound, but it rested on a single critical assumption: that Gallic cavalry would dominate the battlefield as they always had. That assumption was about to be shattered. The battle took place in the open plains near Dijon, in territory that favoured cavalry manoeuvres. Vercingetorix divided his 15,000 horsemen into 3 massive columns and launched them at Caesar's forces in a coordinated charge designed to overwhelm the Roman cavalry and then encircle the infantry. For the first hour, the battle went exactly as Vercingetorix had planned. The Gallic cavalry smashed into the Roman auxiliary horsemen, driving them back through sheer weight and ferocity. Roman cavalry began to waver, some units breaking and fleeing toward the safety of the infantry lines. Caesar watched from a hillside, his face betraying no emotion, but his mind calculating desperately. If the cavalry collapsed entirely, his infantry would be surrounded and massacred. He needed a miracle. And then, at the critical moment, Caesar unleashed his secret weapon, the Germanic cavalry auxiliaries he had been holding in reserve. The Germanic horsemen exploded into the Gallic flank like a thunderbolt. These were warriors from across the Rhine, recruited from the Ubii and other tribes who had their own blood feuds with the Gauls. They were bigger than the Gallic cavalry, mounted on heavier horses, and they fought with a savage brutality that shocked even hardened warriors. More importantly, they were fresh, whereas the Gallic cavalry had exhausted themselves in the initial charge. The Germanic riders tore into Vercingetorix's horsemen with axes and long swords, dragging Gallic nobles from their saddles and butchering them in the mud. The Gallic cavalry, which had been on the verge of victory moments earlier, suddenly found themselves fighting for survival. Panic spread through the tribal squadrons, formations disintegrated, warriors who had charged with such confidence now wheeled their horses and fled. Vercingetorix tried desperately to rally them, riding among his men and shouting for them to stand, but the rout had become unstoppable. The Germanic cavalry pursued them for miles, cutting down thousands. It was a complete disaster. The cavalry defeat changed everything. Vercingetorix had staked his credibility on Gallic superiority in mounted warfare, and Caesar had destroyed that myth in a single afternoon. Worse, the defeat cost the rebellion approximately 3,000 of its best warriors, nobles and chieftains who could never be replaced. The psychological impact was devastating. Gallic morale plummeted. Tribal chieftains began questioning Vercingetorix's leadership, wondering if they had placed their faith in the wrong man. Caesar, sensing weakness, pushed his advantage. His legions began advancing aggressively, and for the first time since Gergovia, the momentum shifted back toward Rome. Vercingetorix needed to restore confidence and buy time for reinforcements to arrive from the outer tribes. He needed a fortress where his army could regroup, resupply, and prepare for a final confrontation. He chose a hilltop settlement called Alesia, the fortified capital of the Mandubi tribe, located on a plateau surrounded by valleys and rivers. It seemed like the perfect defensive position. It would prove to be a death trap. Alesia sat on Mont Auxois, a flat-topped hill rising nearly 500 feet above the surrounding plains. The settlement covered about 200 acres and was protected by thick stone walls on the most vulnerable approaches. 2 rivers, the Ossès and the Osserane, flanked the hill on either side, making assault from those directions nearly impossible. To the west stretched an open plain, but any attacking army would have to cross exposed ground under constant missile fire from the walls. It looked impregnable. Vercingetorix marched his army, now numbering around 80,000 warriors, into Alesia and prepared to withstand a siege. He sent messengers racing to every corner of Gaul with urgent pleas for reinforcement. Every tribe that valued freedom was ordered to send warriors to Alesia for a final decisive battle. The plan was simple: hold out until the relief army arrived, then crush Caesar between 2 massive forces. Vercingetorix stockpiled grain, slaughtered cattle for meat, and rationed water. His scouts reported that Caesar was approaching with his full force. The stage was set for the greatest siege in ancient history. When Caesar arrived at Alesia and surveyed the hilltop fortress, his engineers and officers expected him to assault the walls directly. That was standard Roman doctrine. Bring up siege towers, build ramps, storm the fortifications. But Caesar looked at Alesia and saw something different. He saw that the hills surrounding the settlement were roughly at the same elevation as Alesia itself, which negated the fortress's height advantage. More importantly, he realized that Vercingetorix had made a fatal strategic error by bottling his entire army inside a fortification. Caesar did not need to storm Alesia. He needed to trap it. He issued orders that would result in the most ambitious military engineering project of the ancient world. His legions would build not 1, but 2 complete rings of fortifications around Alesia, an inner ring to pen in Vercingetorix, and an outer ring to protect against the relief army he knew was coming. It would be a fortress within a fortress, and Caesar's army would sit in the middle. The construction project was staggering in scope and executed with breathtaking speed. The inner fortification, called the circumvallation, stretched for 11 Roman miles, approximately 16 kilometers of continuous defensive works, completely encircling Alesia. Caesar's engineers began by digging a trench about 20 feet across with perpendicular sides, too wide to cross and too deep to climb. Behind that they dug 2 more trenches, each about 15 feet wide and of equal depth. The innermost trench was filled with water diverted from the nearby rivers, creating a moat that glittered in the sun like a serpent coiled around the hill. Behind the trenches, Roman legionaries constructed a rampart 12 feet high, crowned with a wooden palisade. Sharpened stakes protruded from the top, angled downward to impale anyone trying to scale the wall. Every 80 feet along the circumvallation stood a wooden tower, each one 20 feet high and equipped with scorpion bolt throwers and light artillery. In total, the inner ring featured 23 redoubts connected by the continuous wall, but Caesar was not finished. In front of the trenches, the Romans installed a nightmare array of obstacles designed to shred any attacking force. First came 5 rows of sharpened logs called tombstones. These were stakes as thick as a man's thigh, planted in the ground and woven together so they could not be uprooted, creating a nearly impenetrable thicket. Anyone trying to push through would be funneled into killing zones. Beyond that, the engineers dug shallow pits in a checkerboard pattern, each pit containing a sharpened stake concealed beneath loose brush. These were called lilies, and they were designed to impale the legs of charging warriors or horses. Finally, closer to the trenches, the Romans hammered in iron stakes with barbed hooks, set at angles so that anyone running forward in the dark would tear their legs open on the metal spikes. These were called stimuli, goads, and they were devilishly effective. The entire obstacle belt stretched for hundreds of yards in front of the walls, and every inch of it was designed to slow, wound, and demoralize attackers, while Roman archers and artillerymen rained death from the towers. While construction was underway, Vercingetorix launched desperate cavalry raids to disrupt the work. Gallic horsemen would thunder down from Alesia, trying to reach the construction sites before Roman infantry could form defensive lines. For a few days, these raids succeeded in delaying progress and killing Roman engineers. But Caesar adapted. He positioned entire legions in formation between the construction sites and Alesia, creating a human shield that the Gallic cavalry could not penetrate. His Germanic auxiliary cavalry pursued any Gallic riders who ventured too far from the fortress, turning the raids into suicide missions. After several costly failures, Vercingetorix realized the cavalry was too valuable to waste on futile attacks. He made a critical decision. He sent his entire cavalry force, all 15,000 remaining horsemen, out of Alesia under cover of darkness with orders to ride to every corner of Gaul and summon the relief army. They would break through Caesar's incomplete lines and return with overwhelming force. It was the right strategic decision, but it had an unintended consequence. Without cavalry, Vercingetorix lost his ability to raid Roman supply lines or scout Caesar's movements. He was blind, trapped, and completely cut off. With the Gallic cavalry gone, Caesar's legions worked around the clock. The circumvallation was completed in 3 weeks, a feat of engineering that staggered ancient observers and remains impressive even by modern standards. But Caesar knew the relief army was coming, and when it arrived his forces would be trapped between 2 enemies. So he ordered construction of a second fortification line, the contravallation, facing outward. This outer ring stretched for 14 Roman miles, nearly 21 kilometres of fortifications identical to the inner ring. It featured the same trenches, the same palisades, the same towers and obstacles. When the work was complete, Caesar had created a double-walled fortress with his 60,000 legionaries sandwiched between them. The inner wall kept Vercingetorix penned in Alesia. The outer wall would hold back the relief army, and Caesar's forces, occupying the space between, would have to defend both walls simultaneously while besieged from both sides. It was an insane strategy, brilliant and desperate in equal measure. Caesar was gambling everything on the strength of those wooden walls and the discipline of his legions. Inside Alesia, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Vercingetorix had planned for a garrison of 80,000 warriors, but the civilian population of the Mandubii tribe, perhaps another 50,000 men, women and children, remained in the city. That meant 130,000 mouths to feed with supplies meant for 80,000. The grain stores began running low within the first 2 weeks. Vercingetorix implemented strict rationing, cutting daily rations in half, then in quarters. Warriors who had marched into Alesia strong and confident now weakened visibly, their ribs showing through their skin, their faces hollow. The livestock were slaughtered and consumed, then the dogs, then the horses, then there was nothing left. Starvation set in with cruel efficiency. Children cried endlessly from hunger. The elderly grew too weak to move and simply lay down to die. Warriors fought over scraps of mouldy bread. The smell of death hung over the hilltop like a shroud. Vercingetorix faced an impossible choice. He could not feed everyone. If he did nothing, his warriors would starve and become too weak to fight when the relief army arrived. So he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered the Mandubi civilians, the women, children and elderly, to be expelled from Alesia. Perhaps 50,000 people, the tribe that had welcomed him and sheltered his army, were driven out of the gates at spear point. They walked down the slopes toward the Roman lines, a vast column of refugees staggering from hunger, carrying infants and supporting the sick. They believed, hoped, prayed that Caesar would let them pass through his lines. They were wrong. Caesar refused. He would not waste food on enemy civilians, and he knew that compassion now would weaken his position. Roman soldiers on the walls watched the refugees approach and did nothing. They did not open the gates. They did not offer water. They simply stood there, spears ready, faces blank. The refugees reached the trenches and obstacles, and there they stopped, realizing the Romans would not let them through. They turned back toward Alesia, climbing the slopes toward the gates they had been expelled from hours earlier. But Vercingetorix, knowing he could not feed them, refused to open the gates. The Mandubi civilians were trapped in the no man's land between the fortress and the Roman walls. For days they remained there, crying out for mercy, begging for food, pleading to be let in by either side. Neither side relented. Slowly, horribly, they began to starve to death. Ancient sources describe the sounds that echoed across the valley. The wailing of mothers holding dead children, the screams of the dying, the eerie silence as entire families expired from hunger and exposure. Caesar watched from his command post and wrote later that this was necessary. Vercingetorix watched from the walls of Alesia and wept. When it was over, perhaps 50,000 people had died in the open ground between the armies, their bodies left to rot as a grim reminder of the cost of war. It was one of the great atrocities of the Gallic Wars, and both sides shared the guilt. By mid-September 57 BC, Vercingetorix's army was on the verge of collapse. The warriors were so weak from starvation that they could barely stand, let alone fight. Supplies were completely exhausted. The city had become a charnel house, the streets littered with corpses of warriors who had simply died from hunger. Vercingetorix himself was gaunt, his face hollow, his eyes burning with desperate hope. Everything now depended on the relief army. If it did not come soon, Alesia would fall without a battle, and the rebellion would die with a whimper rather than a roar. Caesar, watching from his fortifications, knew he had won unless the relief army arrived in overwhelming force. His legions were exhausted from weeks of construction and constant guard duty, but they were fed and rested. The trap was set. All that remained was to see if the Gauls would walk into it. And then, on a morning in late September, Roman scouts on the outer walls reported movement on the horizon. It was not dust from a small raiding party. It were vast clouds stretching from one end of the valley to the other, the kind of dust raised only by a truly enormous army on the march. The relief army had arrived, and it was far, far larger than anyone had imagined. According to Caesar's own account, likely exaggerated but still indicative of the scale, the Gallic relief force numbered 250,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry. Modern historians believe the actual number was closer to 100,000, but even that would make it one of the largest armies assembled in ancient Europe. Every major tribe in Gaul had sent warriors. The Aedui came with 35,000 men, the Arverni sent 15,000, the Sequani, the Senones, the Bituriges, dozens of tribes marching under their own banners toward Alesia. They came to save Vercingetorix. They came to destroy Caesar, They came to free Gaul. The relief army camped on the western plain, just out of artillery range from Caesar's outer wall. Their campfires stretched for miles, a constellation of flames in the darkness. Inside Alesia, the starving garrison saw those fires and wept with relief. Vercingetorix stood on the walls and stared at that sea of flames, and for the first time in weeks he allowed himself to hope. The next day, the relief army began to move, and with that movement, the final act of the siege and the final act of the Gallic rebellion would begin. Caesar's impossible gamble was about to be tested. The greatest battle of the Gallic Wars was at hand. The Gallic relief army that spread across the western plain before Alesia was unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. Modern historians estimate its size at somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 warriors, though Caesar himself claimed it numbered 250,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry. Even accepting the more conservative estimates, it was a force of staggering magnitude. The largest unified Gallic army ever assembled, drawn from virtually every tribe in Gaul, the Aedui contributed 35,000 men under their chieftains Eporidorix and Viridomarus. The Arverni sent 15,000 under Vercingetorix's cousin Vercassivelaunus. The Sequani brought 12,000. The Senones, the Bituriges, the Lemovices, the Pictones, the Carnutes, tribes that had spent centuries as blood enemies now marched side by side under a single purpose, to free Vercingetorix and destroy Caesar. Their commanders were seasoned warriors, men who had studied Roman tactics and learned from previous defeats. They understood the magnitude of the task before them. They were going to storm the most elaborate fortifications ever constructed in ancient warfare, defended by the most professional soldiers in the world. But they had numbers, courage, and desperation, and they had a plan. Inside Alesia, the starving garrison watched the relief army's campfires spread across the horizon and allowed themselves to hope. Vercingetorix gathered his remaining commanders, men who had once been strong warriors but were now gaunt shadows of themselves, their armour hanging loose on wasted frames. He told them the final battle was at hand, that they must conserve what little strength remained for one last coordinated assault. When the relief army attacked Caesar's outer walls, Vercingetorix would lead a massive sortie from Alesia against the inner walls. Caesar's legions would be crushed between two enormous forces, fighting on two fronts simultaneously with nowhere to retreat. If the plan worked, the Romans would be annihilated and Gaul would be free. If it failed, the rebellion would die, and every man in Alesia would be sold into slavery or executed. There was no middle ground, no possibility of negotiation. This was total war, and only one side would survive. Caesar understood the desperate nature of his situation better than anyone. His 60,000 legionaries were spread across 25 miles of fortifications, manning towers and ramparts on both the inner and outer walls. When the attacks came, and they would come simultaneously from both directions, his forces would be stretched impossibly thin. He could not reinforce one section without weakening another. He could not retreat because there was nowhere to go. The fortifications had to hold, and his men had to fight with a discipline and ferocity they had never shown before. Caesar moved through his camps in the days before the assault, speaking to his legionaries in small groups, reminding them of their victories, promising them unimaginable wealth from the spoils if they won. But he also spoke plainly about what defeat meant: death or slavery for every Roman soldier. Their only hope lay in their training, their walls, and their refusal to break. The legionaries sharpened their swords, repaired their armour, and tried not to think about the overwhelming odds. The first assault came in late September 52 BC. The Gallic relief army surged forward in a massive wave, tens of thousands of warriors charging across the open plain towards Caesar's outer walls. They came with scaling ladders, with fascines, bundles of sticks designed to fill in ditches, with grappling hooks and battering rams. The ground shook with their footsteps. Their war cries rose like thunder, the ancient Celtic battle roar designed to terrify enemies and invoke the favour of their gods. They hit the obstacle belt at full sprint, and the slaughter began immediately. Warriors impaled themselves on the hidden stakes called lilies, their legs pierced through, toppling forward onto more stakes. Others tripped over the iron stimuli and fell screaming, the barbed hooks tearing through muscle and bone. The tombstones, the rows of sharpened logs, funneled the attack into narrow killing zones where Roman archers and artillery crews had prearranged their weapons. Scorpion bolts punched through shields and bodies. Sling stones cracked, skulls. Javelins rained down in sheets. But the Gauls kept coming, climbing over their own dead, driven by fury and desperation. At the same moment, Vercingetorix led his sortie from Alesia. The gates burst open and thousands of Gallic warriors, weakened by starvation but driven by the knowledge that this was their last chance, charged down the slopes towards Caesar's inner walls. They carried the same equipment as the relief army: ladders, fascines, grappling hooks. But they were fighting on sheer willpower now. Men who had been starving for weeks suddenly asked to assault fortifications that had taken Roman engineers months to perfect. They hit the inner obstacles and died in droves, but some made it through to the trenches. They threw fascines into the water-filled moat and tried to construct bridges under a hail of missiles. Roman legionaries on the inner walls fought with mechanical efficiency, each man responsible for a section of rampart, killing anyone who came within range. The battle raged across both walls simultaneously, and Caesar rode between the fronts on horseback, his distinctive scarlet cloak making him a target, but also a rallying point for his troops. For hours the battle continued without pause. The Gauls threw themselves at the walls in wave after wave, and the Romans threw them back with disciplined brutality. The wooden towers along the fortifications became islands of desperate combat, with Gallic warriors climbing ladders only to be impaled by pilum thrusts or knocked back with shield pushes. Some towers changed hands multiple times as Gauls briefly overwhelmed the defenders before Roman reserves counterattacked with swords and fury. The air filled with smoke from fires started deliberately by both sides, Gauls trying to burn the wooden palisades, Romans using fire arrows to ignite Gallic siege equipment. The screams of the wounded and dying merged into a continuous roar that could be heard for miles. But as darkness fell, both Gallic attacks faltered. The warriors had exhausted themselves against fortifications that refused to break. They retreated back to their camps and to Alesia, leaving thousands of dead in the obstacle belts and ditches. Caesar's walls had held, barely. The Romans spent the night in a state of controlled panic. Repair crews worked by torchlight to fix damaged sections of wall, to replace shattered stakes, to fill in parts of the trenches that the Gauls had bridged with fascines and corpses. Medical orderlies moved among the wounded, trying to save the salvageable and providing mercy to the dying. Caesar did not sleep. He moved along the walls inspecting damage, speaking to centurions, calculating reserves. His officers reported casualty figures that were devastating. Perhaps 3,000 Romans killed or wounded in a single evening's fighting. If the Gauls attacked with the same intensity the next day, and the day after that, the defences would eventually collapse. But Caesar was gambling that the Gauls had suffered even heavier losses, that their morale would crack before his fortifications did. It was a brutal calculus of attrition, and he knew that one more coordinated assault might tip the balance. He issued orders for his Germanic cavalry to prepare for a major sortie, and for his remaining reserves to be positioned behind the most vulnerable sections of wall. Then he waited for dawn. The second assault came the following night, a coordinated attack under cover of darkness designed to exploit Roman fatigue and confusion. The Gallic commanders had learned from the first assault's failure. This time they attacked in the dead of night, moving in near silence until they were close to the walls, then erupting with that terrifying war cry. They focused their assault on specific sections of wall rather than attacking along the entire perimeter, concentrating force to achieve breakthrough. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix led another sortie, timing it to coincide with the relief army's assault. The Gauls employed new tactics. They brought bundled branches soaked in pitch and set them alight, hurling them over the ramparts to illuminate Roman positions and create chaos. They used archers to provide covering fire while assault teams moved fascines and ladders into position. And they came in endless waves, each new group of warriors stepping over the bodies of those who'd fallen minutes before. The Romans fought back with equal desperation. In the darkness, the fortifications became a nightmare landscape of fire, blood, and screaming. Roman legionaries stabbed blindly at shapes moving in the darkness. Gallic warriors dragged wounded Romans from the ramparts and butchered them in the ditches. Sections of palisade burned, creating gaps that the Gauls tried to exploit before Roman reserves sealed the breach. Caesar himself led a cohort to reinforce a collapsing section of the inner wall where Vercingetorix's warriors had managed to reach the ramparts. He fought. In the shield wall, his sword rising and falling, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. The legionaries around him, seeing their commander in hand-to-hand combat, fought with renewed fury. Inch by inch, they drove the Gauls back from the walls. On the outer fortifications, similar desperate fights raged at a dozen points. But again, as the night wore toward dawn, the Gallic assaults lost momentum. The warriors were exhausted, their ranks thinned by horrific casualties. They withdrew once more, and Caesar's walls still stood, but barely. The Roman defenders were reaching their breaking point. 2 massive assaults in 2 days had left them exhausted, demoralized, and down to dangerously thin reserves. Entire cohorts had been wiped out. The hospitals overflowed with wounded. Sections of wall stood unmanned for minutes at a time, while commanders rushed available troops from one crisis point to another. Caesar knew that one more major assault would likely succeed. His men simply did not have the strength to repel another coordinated attack. But he also knew the Gauls were suffering just as badly. The relief army had lost perhaps 15,000, 20,000 warriors in 2 days of futile assaults. Vercingetorix's garrison was starving to death, burning their last reserves of strength in suicidal sorties. Both sides were bleeding to death, and whoever broke first would lose everything. Caesar prepared for the final battle with grim determination. He reorganized his reserves, positioned his Germanic cavalry for a decisive counterattack, and waited. The third assault, the final Battle of Alesia, came on September 28th, 56 BC, and it nearly destroyed Caesar's army. The Gallic commanders had scouted the Roman fortifications and identified a weak point in the northwestern sector near Mount Rhea, where the terrain made construction difficult and the walls were lower and less reinforced than elsewhere. They assembled a massive strike force, perhaps 60,000 warriors, under the command of Vercingetorix, Vercingetorix's cousin, and one of the Arverni's most capable generals. The plan was sophisticated, a diversionary assault along multiple points of the outer wall to draw Roman reserves, followed by the main attack at Mount Rhea. Simultaneously, Vercingetorix would lead every able-bodied warrior in Alesia in a final do-or-die sortie against the inner walls. If the Romans reinforced one sector, they would weaken another. If they tried to hold everywhere, they would be too thin anywhere. It was a perfect tactical plan, and it very nearly worked. The diversionary assaults began at dawn, with Gallic warriors attacking the outer walls at multiple points along the southern and eastern sectors. Caesar, unable to determine which attack was real and which was feint, dispatched cohorts to reinforce each threatened section. This left his reserves dangerously depleted. Then the main assault hit Mount Rhea like an avalanche. 60,000 warriors, the cream of the Gallic relief army, surged toward the weakest point in the Roman defences. The two Roman camps in that sector, commanded by Reginus and Rebellus, held fewer than 6,000 legionaries between them. They were instantly overwhelmed. Gallic warriors surged over the lower ramparts, cutting down defenders and establishing footholds inside the fortifications. At the same moment, Vercingetorix launched his sortie from Alesia, with every warrior who could still walk. Starving, desperate men charged the inner walls with the fury of those who knew they were already dead. The Romans fought back savagely, but the walls began to crack. Gaps appeared in the defences. Gallic warriors poured through. For the first time since the siege began, it looked like Caesar's fortifications would fail. Caesar saw the crisis from his command post and made the most critical decision of his military career. He gathered his last reserves, perhaps 6,000 men, and led them personally toward the Mount Rhea sector at a run. He wore his distinctive scarlet cloak so his troops could see him, marking himself as a target but also as a symbol of Roman determination. As he rode toward the collapsing sector, he sent urgent orders to his Germanic cavalry commander: take every horseman available, exit through the eastern gate, circle around outside the fortifications, and hit the Gallic relief army in the rear. It was an all-or-nothing gamble. If the cavalry maneuver failed, Caesar and his reserves would be surrounded and annihilated. If it succeeded, the Gauls might break. There was no middle option. Caesar reached the Mount Rhea sector and threw his reserves into the battle with himself at their head. Ancient sources describe him fighting in the front ranks, calling his centurions by name, rallying panicked legionaries with his presence. The Romans, seeing their commander in mortal danger, found strength they didn't know they still possessed and fought with desperate fury. Outside the fortifications, the Germanic cavalry executed Caesar's orders with devastating effect. Led by their tribal chiefs and hungry for glory, approximately 4,000 Germanic horsemen thundered around the outer perimeter of the fortifications until they reached the rear of the massive Gallic force assaulting Mount Rhea. Then they charged. The Gallic warriors, focused entirely on breaking through the Roman walls in front of them, had no idea the cavalry was coming until hooves and blades crashed into their rear ranks. The Germanic riders tore through the Gallic formation with axes, spears, and long swords, killing warriors who couldn't turn to defend themselves. Panic spread through the Gallic ranks like wildfire. Warriors at the front, hearing screams from behind and seeing comrades fleeing, began to waver. Their assault lost momentum. Roman defenders on the walls, who moments earlier had been on the verge of collapse, sensed the shift and counterattacked with renewed ferocity. Gallic warriors who had established footholds inside, the fortifications were surrounded and cut down. The breakthrough became a rout. Vercingetorix tried desperately to rally his forces, but the collapse was total. 60,000 warriors who moments before had been on the verge of victory now turned and fled in every direction. The Germanic cavalry pursued them across the plain, cutting down thousands. Roman legionaries, emboldened by the reversal, actually climbed over their own walls to join the pursuit, killing exhausted Gallic warriors who could no longer run. The ground between Mount Rhea and the Gallic camps became a killing field, littered with bodies and abandoned weapons. Caesar later claimed that 20,000 Gauls died in the rout, though modern historians believe the figure was closer to 10,000. Either way, it was a catastrophic loss. The relief army, which had seemed unstoppable just hours earlier, was shattered. Survivors fled back to their camps, gathered what they could carry and began the long retreat to their home territories. By nightfall, the plain that had been crowded with 100,000 warriors was nearly empty. The relief army had abandoned Vercingetorix to his fate. Inside Alesia, the warriors who had sortied with Vercingetorix retreated back through the gates and collapsed from exhaustion. They had given everything, every ounce of strength, every reserve of courage, and it had not been enough. Vercingetorix stood on the walls and watched the relief army dissolve into scattered bands fleeing across the horizon. He watched the Germanic cavalry return to Caesar's fortifications, dragging captured Gallic standards through the mud. He watched as Roman work crews began repairing the walls that his warriors had almost broken through, and he understood that it was over. The rebellion had failed. Gaul would not be free. His people would not be saved. Everything he had fought for, every sacrifice he had demanded, every city he had burned, and every warrior who had died, all of it had been for nothing. The walls of Alesia had held. Caesar had won. That night, inside the starving fortress, Vercingetorix convened a council of his remaining chieftains. He told them they had fought with honour, that no one could question their courage or their devotion to freedom. But the situation was hopeless. They had no food, no reinforcements, no hope of breaking through the Roman fortifications. If they continued fighting, every warrior in Alesia would die of starvation or be slaughtered when the Romans finally stormed the walls. Vercingetorix proposed an alternative. He would surrender himself to Caesar and beg for mercy for his warriors. Perhaps, if Caesar had his prize, the rebel king who had dared to unite Gaul, he would spare the common soldiers who had simply followed their leader. It was a slim hope, but it was the only hope that remained. The chieftains wept as they accepted his decision. They had followed this young king into battle believing he could deliver freedom, and now they would watch him sacrifice himself for their survival. The next morning, envoys from Alesia rode down to Caesar's command post under a white flag. They requested terms for surrender. Caesar's response was terse and brutal, unconditional surrender, all weapons to be laid down, all leaders to present themselves for judgment, no negotiations. The envoys returned to Alesia with the message, and Vercingetorix prepared for his final act. He dressed himself in his finest armour, polished bronze that gleamed in the sun, a long red cloak, a golden torque around his neck that marked his royal status. He mounted his finest horse, a white stallion that had carried him through countless battles, and then he rode down from Alesia towards Caesar's camp, alone. Behind him, 80,000 starving warriors watched from the walls. Ahead, 60,000 Roman legionaries lined the fortifications in silence. The last king of the Gauls rode to surrender himself to Rome. The image of Vercingetorix's surrender has echoed through 2,000 years of history, immortalized in paintings, sculptures, and the collective memory of France. Ancient sources describe the scene with stark simplicity, but the symbolism was profound. The young king who had united Gaul, who had defeated Caesar at Gergovia, who had come within a hair's breadth of driving Rome from Celtic lands forever, now rode alone toward his enemy's camp. He wore his ceremonial armour, polished bronze that caught the morning light, a crimson cloak that flowed behind him, and the golden torque of kingship around his neck. His white horse moved at a deliberate pace, neither hurried nor hesitant. Every Roman soldier on the fortifications watched in silence. Every Gallic warrior on Alesia's walls stood frozen. This was not just a military surrender. It was the end of an era, the death of Gallic independence, the moment when the Celtic world passed into Roman dominion. Caesar had ordered a platform constructed, outside his headquarters tent, a raised tribunal where he would receive the surrender in full view of both armies. He sat in his curule chair, the symbol of Roman authority, surrounded by his officers and senior centurions. The legionaries formed ranks around the tribunal, creating a corridor through which Vercingetorix would approach. It was theatre, carefully staged to demonstrate Roman power and Gallic submission. As Vercingetorix approached the platform, accounts diverge on exactly what happened next. Some ancient sources claim he dismounted, walked directly to Caesar, and laid his weapons at the general's feet without speaking a word. Others describe a more dramatic gesture, Vercingetorix circling Caesar's platform on horseback before dismounting, removing his armour piece by piece and kneeling in silence. What all sources agree on is that Vercingetorix spoke very few words, if any. There was no passionate speech, no plea for mercy, no dramatic final defiance. He simply surrendered himself completely and waited for Caesar's judgment. Caesar's response was cold and calculated. He did not speak to Vercingetorix directly. Instead, he issued orders to his guards. The Gallic king was to be bound in chains and held for transport to Rome. Vercingetorix would not be executed immediately, nor would he be granted the honourable death that Gallic custom demanded for defeated kings. Instead, Caesar had other plans. Vercingetorix would be paraded through the streets of Rome in Caesar's eventual triumph, displayed in chains as proof of Roman supremacy over the barbarian Gauls. Only after that humiliation would he be executed. It was punishment designed to break not just the man, but the legend he represented. Roman soldiers clapped Vercingetorix in iron shackles and led him away to a prison wagon. The last king of the Gauls walked between the Roman ranks with his head high, his face expressionless. He did not beg, he did not weep, he maintained his dignity, even in absolute defeat, and in doing so, he earned the grudging respect even of his enemies. The warriors remaining in Alesia were not granted the mercy Vercingetorix had hoped to buy with his surrender. Caesar ordered the gates opened and the survivors marched out for processing. Approximately 80,000 Gallic warriors, starved to near skeletons, weakened by weeks of siege, many unable to walk without support, stumbled down from the hilltop fortress. Roman soldiers separated them by tribe and began the grim business of enslavement. Caesar's policy was brutal and methodical. Each of his legionaries would receive one Gallic prisoner as personal property, to be kept as a slave or sold for profit. The rest would be auctioned to slave traders who had already gathered outside the Roman camp like vultures, knowing that the fall of Alesia would flood the market with human merchandise. Families were separated. Warriors who had fought for freedom were chained together in coffles and marched toward Mediterranean slave markets. Children were torn from their mothers' arms. The elderly and infirm, too weak to march and worthless as slaves, were simply left to die outside Alesia's walls. The fate of the Aedui and Arverni prisoners was slightly different, reflecting Caesar's political calculations. These two tribes were among the most powerful in Gaul, and Caesar needed to secure their future loyalty, or at least their neutrality, if he was to pacify the region. He announced that Aedui and Arverni prisoners would be returned to their tribes without ransom, a gesture of clemency designed to drive a wedge between tribal leaders and the defeated rebels. Approximately 20,000 warriors from these two tribes were released and sent home with the message that Caesar could be merciful to those who accepted Roman authority. The remaining 60,000 captives from other tribes were not so fortunate. They were sold into slavery, fetching prices that made Caesar and his officers fantastically wealthy. Roman historians estimated that the sale of Alesia's captives generated approximately 15,000 talents of silver, enough money to pay Caesar's legions for years and fund his upcoming civil war against Pompey and the Senate. The conquest of Gaul had been profitable beyond imagination. With Vercingetorix captured and Alesia fallen, resistance across Gaul collapsed like a structure with its central pillar removed. Some tribes attempted to continue the fight. The Carnutes held out for several more months before being crushed, their territory devastated and their population sold into slavery. The Bellovaci in the north organized a brief rebellion in 51 BC, but Caesar's legions destroyed them with mechanical efficiency. Small bands of warriors retreated into forests and mountains, waging guerrilla campaigns that gradually faded into banditry and then into nothing. By 50 BC, the Gallic Wars were effectively over. Caesar had conquered a territory roughly the size of modern France, Belgium, and parts of Germany, adding millions of people and vast wealth to the Roman Republic. The human cost was staggering. Modern historians estimate that during Caesar's 8-year campaign in Gaul, approximately 1 million Gauls were killed and another million enslaved. Entire tribes ceased to exist. Cities that had stood for centuries were burned to ash. The Celtic civilization that had dominated Western Europe for half a millennium was broken forever. Vercingetorix spent the next 6 years in a Roman prison, held in the Tullianum, a dark underground dungeon beneath the Forum in Rome reserved for enemies of the state awaiting execution. The Tullianum was not designed for long-term imprisonment. It was a holding cell where condemned prisoners spent their final hours before being strangled or thrown down the execution shaft. But Caesar kept Vercingetorix alive for 6 years, waiting for the perfect moment to display his captured king. Those years were consumed by Caesar's civil war against Pompey and the Senate, a conflict that would transform the Roman Republic into an empire. Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC, plunging Rome into civil war. He defeated Pompey at Pharsalus in 48 BC, pursued his enemies to Egypt where he became entangled with Cleopatra, and fought campaigns across the Mediterranean to crush the last resistance. Through all of this, Vercingetorix remained chained in the Tullianum, forgotten by everyone except the guards who brought him bread and water. Imagine those 6 years in darkness. Vercingetorix, who had once led 100,000 warriors and come within inches of driving Rome from Gaul, now spent his days in a cell barely large enough to stand. The dungeon was cold, damp, and completely dark except for the brief moments when guards opened the door. He could hear the sounds of Rome above him, the bustle of the Forum, the speeches of senators, the celebrations of victories, but he was buried alive beneath it all. Ancient sources provide no record of his thoughts during this time, no letters or statements. We know only that he survived those 6 years, which suggest he maintained some measure of physical health and mental resilience. Perhaps he clung to hope that Caesar would eventually grant him an honourable death. Perhaps he made peace with his fate and found some internal strength in knowing he had fought with everything he had. Or perhaps he simply endured, one day at a time, because that was all he could do. In 46 BC, Caesar finally returned to Rome after defeating the last of his civil war enemies at the Battle of Thapsus in North Africa. He had been granted unprecedented powers by a cowed Senate, dictator for 10 years, with the right to celebrate multiple triumphs for his various victories. Caesar planned 4 separate triumph processions to celebrate his conquests of Gaul, Egypt, Pontus, and Africa. These would be the most spectacular triumphs Rome had ever witnessed, carefully orchestrated, propaganda displays designed to cement Caesar's position as the greatest general in Roman history. Each triumph would feature captured treasures, exotic animals, theatrical reenactments of battles, and most importantly, captured enemy leaders paraded in chains before being executed. For the Gallic triumph, Caesar had preserved his greatest prize, Vercingetorix, the rebel king who had united Gaul and nearly defeated Rome. The triumph took place in September 46 BC, and it was a spectacle of almost obscene magnificence. Caesar entered Rome riding in a golden chariot pulled by 4 white horses, dressed in a purple toga embroidered with golden palm leaves. He wore a laurel crown and held a scepter topped with an eagle. Behind him marched his victorious legions, singing bawdy songs and carrying placards depicting scenes from the Gallic campaigns. Wagons overflowing with gold, silver, and plundered treasures rolled through the streets. Exotic animals from Gaul, including live aurochs, were paraded before the crowds. Painted scenery depicted Alesia and other conquered cities, and in the midst of this procession, surrounded by guards and displayed like a trophy, walked Vercingetorix. The man who had been the last king of the Gauls was now a broken spectacle. 6 years in the Tullianum had taken a terrible toll. Ancient descriptions suggest he was thin, pale from years without sunlight, his hair and beard grown long and unkempt. But he still wore chains of gold rather than iron, a mark of his royal status, and he walked upright despite everything. The Roman crowds jeered and threw refuse at him. They cursed him as a barbarian and an enemy of Rome. Children were held up to see the terrible rebel who had dared challenge Caesar. For hours Vercingetorix was marched through the streets of Rome, while the city celebrated his defeat and Caesar's glory. It was humiliation designed to break his spirit and send a message to any other people who might consider rebelling against Roman power. This is what happens to those who defy Rome. When the procession reached the Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, Caesar performed the traditional sacrifice of bulls to the god Jupiter, thanking him for Rome's victory. Then came the final ritual of the triumph, the execution of captured enemy leaders. Vercingetorix was led down from the temple to the Tullianum below, the same dungeon where he had spent 6 years. In the traditional Roman manner for executing foreign enemies, he was executed by strangulation. There was no ceremony, no final speech, no acknowledgement of his courage or his cause. He was simply killed, his body disposed of, his name added to the list of enemies Rome had defeated. Caesar had waited 6 years for this moment, to parade his greatest enemy through Rome and then execute him at the height of his own triumph. It was the ultimate demonstration of Roman power and Caesar's personal glory. But death did not end. Vercingetorix's story, it transformed it. In the immediate aftermath of his execution, he was simply another defeated barbarian, a footnote in Caesar's rise to power. Caesar himself barely mentioned Vercingetorix in his writings after Alesia, focusing instead on his own tactical genius. For centuries, Vercingetorix remained a minor figure in Roman histories, occasionally noted as the leader of the Gallic rebellion but given little significance. Rome conquered, Rome triumphed, and the vanquished were forgotten. But in Gaul itself, among the descendants of the tribes that had fought at Alesia, the memory persisted. Oral traditions kept his name alive. Stories of the young king who had united the tribes and nearly defeated Caesar were passed from generation to generation. He became a symbol of resistance, of courage in the face of impossible odds, of sacrifice for a greater cause. Centuries later, when Rome itself fell and new peoples emerged from the ruins of the Western Empire, Vercingetorix began his transformation into legend. Medieval French writers rediscovered his story and cast him as a proto-French hero, a defender of Gallic liberty against Roman tyranny. By the 19th century, during the rise of nationalism across Europe, Vercingetorix had been fully rehabilitated as a national symbol. Napoleon III commissioned archaeological excavations at Alesia and erected a massive statue of Vercingetorix on the site of the ancient fortress. The statue depicts him as a heroic warrior king, sword raised high, standing atop the hill where he made his last stand. The inscription reads, "Gaul united, forming a single nation, animated by a common spirit, can defy the universe." Vercingetorix had been transformed from a defeated rebel into the symbolic founder of French resistance to foreign domination. This mythologization reached its peak during World War II, when both Vichy France and the French resistance claimed Vercingetorix as their symbol. The Vichy regime saw him as a noble leader who sacrificed himself for his people, much as Marshal Pétain claimed to be doing by collaborating with Nazi Germany. The resistance saw him as a symbol of defiance against foreign occupation, a man who fought to his last breath for freedom. In the post-war years, Vercingetorix settled into his role as a foundational figure in French national mythology. Taught in schools as the first great French hero, even though the concept of France would not exist for another 1,000 years after his death. His image appears on coins, stamps, monuments, and in countless works of art. He has been the subject of novels, films, and even comic books. The man who died alone in a Roman dungeon, strangled and forgotten, became immortal. The irony is profound. Caesar won the military victory at Alesia. He conquered Gaul, enslaved its people, and executed its king. But Vercingetorix won the historical and moral victory. Today, Caesar is remembered as a brilliant but ruthless conqueror, a man whose ambition plunged Rome into civil war and whose campaigns in Gaul constituted what we might now call genocide. Vercingetorix, by contrast, is remembered as a hero. Flawed, perhaps, ultimately defeated, but noble in his cause and courageous in his sacrifice. The very qualities that made him dangerous to Rome, his ability to unite disparate peoples, his willingness to sacrifice everything for freedom, his refusal to surrender his dignity even in defeat, are what transformed him into a legend. Modern historians have worked to strip away the myth and examine the historical reality. The real Vercingetorix was likely a more complex figure than either Roman propaganda or French nationalism suggests. He was a skilled politician and military commander, but also a pragmatist who made brutal decisions, including the scorched earth policy that destroyed his own people's homes and the expulsion of civilians from Alesia to save food for his warriors. He united Gaul not through some mystical charisma alone, but through careful alliance building, exploitation of tribal grievances against Rome, and probably a fair amount of coercion. His military strategy was innovative but not infallible. His decision to abandon guerrilla tactics and face Caesar at Alesia was the mistake that doomed the rebellion. He was, in short, a human being trying to navigate an impossible situation, making both inspired and catastrophic decisions under immense pressure. But perhaps that is what makes his story so powerful. Vercingetorix was not a superhuman hero or a perfect military genius. He was a young man, probably in his late 20s, who inherited a legacy of resistance from his murdered father, who watched his people being systematically destroyed, and who decided to fight back even though the odds were overwhelming. He achieved something extraordinary by uniting tribes that has been enemies for generations. He inflicted Caesar's first major defeat at Gergovia and came shockingly close to victory at Alesia. When defeat became inevitable, he chose to sacrifice himself in hopes of saving his warriors. He maintained his dignity through 6 years of imprisonment and walked to his execution with his head held high. These were the choices of a real person facing unbearable circumstances, and they resonate across the centuries precisely because they were human choices that revealed both strength and vulnerability. The legacy of Vercingetorix and the Gallic Wars extends far beyond French nationalism or military history. The conquest of Gaul fundamentally altered the trajectory of Western civilization. Roman culture, law, language and infrastructure spread across what would become France, Belgium and parts of Germany. Latin evolved into French and other Romance languages. Roman roads, aqueducts and cities became the foundation for medieval European civilization. Christianity spread through the former Gallic territories via Roman infrastructure. The very concept of Europe as a cultural and political entity traces its roots to the Roman conquest and Romanization of Celtic lands. None of that would have occurred, or at least not in the same way, if Vercingetorix had succeeded at Alesia. The world we inhabit today was shaped by his defeat, yet we remember him not for losing, but for fighting. That is the final paradox of Vercingetorix's story. History is written by the victors, as the saying goes, and Caesar certainly wrote his version of the Gallic Wars to glorify himself. But across the centuries something shifted. We look back at Alesia and see not just Roman tactical brilliance, but human tragedy. We see 80,000 people starving inside a fortress, 50,000 civilians dying in the no-man's land, a young king riding alone toward his enemy to save his warriors. We see courage in the face of annihilation. We see the eternal human struggle for freedom against overwhelming power. And we remember the last king of the Gauls not as Caesar wanted him remembered, as a defeated barbarian, but as a symbol of resistance, sacrifice, and the unconquerable human spirit. Vercingetorix died in 46 BC. Strangled in a Roman dungeon and dumped in an unmarked grave. But his story refuses to die. It echoes through every resistance movement, every struggle against occupation, every fight for self-determination. It reminds us that some battles are worth fighting even when victory is impossible, that dignity can survive even absolute defeat, and that the courage to stand against tyranny has a value that transcends winning or losing. The man who united Gaul for one brief shining moment before the darkness fell has become immortal precisely because he failed. His defeat made him human. His courage made him eternal. And that is the final bittersweet triumph of the last king of the Gauls. 2,000 years has passed since the Siege of Alesia. But the questions it raises remain urgent and unanswered. What price should a people pay for freedom? When is resistance futile, and when is it necessary? How should we judge leaders who demand terrible sacrifices for causes that ultimately fail? Vercingetorix ordered his people to burn their own cities and watch their children starve, and in the end, Gaul fell to Rome anyway? Was his rebellion a noble stand for liberty, or a tragic miscalculation that brought even more suffering to his people? There are no easy answers. Perhaps there are no answers at all, only the recognition that some choices cannot be avoided, that history sometimes offers only terrible options, and that we honour those who made impossible decisions by remembering them honestly, flaws, failures, and all. The last king of the Gauls united a nation that had never been united before, and came within a hair's breadth of changing the course of Western civilization. He fought against impossible odds, sacrificed everything for a chance at freedom, and maintained his dignity even in absolute defeat. Caesar may have won the battle, but history remembers both men, and increasingly, it is Vercingetorix who represents something eternal about the human spirit, while Caesar represents the eternal temptation of power. At Alesia, two men and two visions of the world collided. One vision triumphed militarily, the other triumphed morally. And the world we inhabit today was forged in that collision, shaped by that siege, and haunted still by the echoes of those desperate battles fought on a hilltop in Gaul so long ago. Stand on Mount Auxerrois today, at the site of ancient Alesia, and you can still trace the outlines of Caesar's fortifications. Archaeological excavations have revealed the trenches, the ramparts, the remains of the towers. You can walk the ground where 200,000 warriors clashed in the final desperate battle. You can stand at the base of the statue of Vercingetorix, that towering bronze figure with sword raised high, and look out over the valleys where the relief army camped and where the Germanic cavalry made their decisive charge. The land is peaceful now, French farmland and forests, but the ghosts are there. The ground remembers, and so should we. This is the brutal truth of the Gallic Wars. There were no clean victories, no simple heroes, only human beings making impossible choices in a world that offered them no mercy. Vercingetorix chose to fight, and his people paid the price. Caesar chose to conquer, and his legacy is soaked in blood. Between them, they destroyed a civilization and built the foundations of a new one. We're the inheritors of that destruction and that creation, living in the world they made. The least we can do is remember them honestly, not as myths or propaganda, but as they were, brilliant, flawed, desperate, courageous human beings who shaped history with their choices and paid for it with their lives. The last king of the Gauls rode to his death in chains, but his name echoes through the ages. That is his final victory. That is his revenge against Rome. And that is why, 2,000 years later, we still tell his story. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of history's most brutal and compelling stories. If you want to support this channel and help us bring more epic tales from the wars that shape civilization, please consider joining our Patreon community. Patrons get early access to videos, behind-the-scenes content, exclusive deep dives on historical topics, and direct input on which stories we cover next. The link is in the description. Every contribution, no matter how small, keeps this channel alive and allows us to keep exploring the brutal truth of history. Until next time, remember the fallen, honour the brave, and never forget that the echoes of the past still shape our world today. This is Wars in History.